At here is a Sumerian tablet that actually shows the tree of life. Scientists fed 5,000-year-old Sumerian tablets into an AI, and what came back terrified them. Not because the machine failed, but because it worked. Clay tablets no living person had fully read in 4,000 years. Shell had normally started speaking, and the words that came back were too precise, too advanced, too far ahead of their time to belong where we found them.
The researchers sat staring at readings that should not exist, feeling something closer to dread than discovery. Because the moment those tablets spoke, everything we thought we knew about where civilization began started to come apart. No one is really just kind of trying to piece stuff together, specifically talking about these ancient tablets.
The old story. Around 5,000 years ago, in the flat sun-baked land between the Tigris and the Euphrates, in what is now southern Iraq, a civilization appeared seemingly out of nowhere. Cities, laws, organized religion, irrigation, and agriculture on an industrial scale, a professional class of administrators, and above all, writing. We call these people the Sumerians, and for over a century we have credited them with essentially inventing civilization as a concept. The wheel, the plow, the first legal codes, the first schools, the first libraries, even the first recorded love poem, which is a great deal more explicit than your high school English teacher would ever have been comfortable assigning. You are welcome for that. They wrote everything down, and they wrote it in a script we call ununiform. Pressed into wet clay with a reed stylus and then dried in the sun or fired in a kiln. Which is why clay better than paper and better than any hard drive carried their words to us across 5,000 years. Hundreds of thousands of these tablets have come out of the ground across the ancient Near East. The British Museum holds over 130,000 of them. The Iraq Museum in Baghdad holds tens of thousands more. Collections in Philadelphia, Chicago, Paris, and Istanbul each hold lifetimes of research. And they contain everything. Tax records, religious hymns, medical texts, astronomical observations, legal codes, myth, private letters between merchants. Whole categories of writing we have not even managed to sort properly yet. And here is the part almost nobody outside the field knows. The overwhelming majority of these tablets have never been fully translated. Not because anyone is lazy, and not only because the funding has always been thin, though it has. The real reason is simpler and far more unsettling. Almost nobody alive can read them. So they can kind of say it's all fantasy and fairy tales, and this is how they express themselves or how they understood the universe. It's all mythology. It's all fake. But in reality, it's not all fake. The translation problem. Ununiform is not an alphabet. Sit with that because it is the key to everything that follows. It is a mixed system. Some signs stand for a whole word or a whole idea. Others for sounds you assemble into words. And the same sign can shift meaning entirely depending on the context around it, the century it was carved in, and the regional dialect of the scribe who pressed it into the clay. Worse than that, the Sumerian language was spoken for roughly 1,000 years, and then stopped being anyone's mother tongue and survived only as a written scholarly language, kept alive by scribes who no longer spoke it. We are decoding a dead language that was already dead to many of the people writing it. Picture a library of medieval Latin manuscripts copied by monks who only ever read Latin and never spoke a word of it. Working from older copies that were themselves copies of copies. Except the pages are broken clay 4,000 years older. Then there is the physical problem on top of the linguistic one. Edges are snapped off. Whole sections are missing. Some tablets were written in a professional shorthand that assumes the reader already knows the missing context. Some are packed with technical vocabulary from trades that no longer exist, using terms nobody bothered to define because at the time, everybody knew what they meant. And the script itself did not stay still. Ununiform changed dramatically across its 30,000-year life. So a tablet from 2800 BCE looks like a different writing system than one from 600 BCE, even though we file both under the same name. Before a scholar can even begin to read a tablet, they have to identify its period, its region, its genre, and its dialect. Every single tablet is a puzzle wrapped around another puzzle. So the math is brutal. A gifted specialist might produce reliable translations of a few hundred tablets in an entire career. The number of people on Earth genuinely fluent in ancient Sumerian can be counted in the low hundreds. A few hundred experts against the better part of 1 million tablets. You do not need to be good at arithmetic to see that this never balances. So the tablets sit in drawers cataloged and numbered and shelved since the 1800s, holding knowledge nobody had the human capacity to read. The scholars knew this was a crisis. They knew critical knowledge was locked inside these objects. But you cannot solve a human capacity problem by wishing for more humans who do not exist. What the field needed was something that could read millions of examples at once, hold every tablet in mind at the same moment, cross-reference every known translation in real time and never tire, never retire, never lose its funding. What it got, as it turns out, was exactly that: enter the machine. In 2023, a team working on what became known as the Babylonian Engine Project. Computational linguists, working hand-in-hand with the Syriologists, built a large language model and trained it specifically on ununiform. Not a general-purpose AI that happened to glance at a few tablets. A purpose-built system fed every digitized ununiform text available, every known sign list, every grammar reference, every scholarly translation produced across a century and a half of the field. Think about the difference between handing a brain surgery to a general practitioner and handing it to a neurosurgeon. When the stakes are this high, that distinction is everything. Sumerian tablets are probably one of the oldest form of a written record that we have. This was the neurosurgeon. The training data swept in the entire digital corpus of ununiform mathematical texts. The major online ununiform libraries, the state archives of Assyria, decades of published translations, and thousands of scholarly papers dissecting the finest grammatical features of Sumerian and Akkadian, the language that gradually replaced Sumerian, but kept using the same wedge-shaped script. For the first time, one reader had complete simultaneous access to every known ununiform text in digital form. CROSS, referenced against every known translation, able to spot statistical patterns and how signs were used and what they meant across the entire body of writing at the same moment. A human expert builds that knowledge slowly, decade by decade, tablet by tablet, learning the patterns by feel through a lifetime of immersion. The machine absorbed the equivalent of every ununiform scholar's lifetime of work all at once. And then it started seeing patterns no single mind could ever hold in one place. And here is the part that is genuinely hard to wrap your head around. So let me say it the way I would to you at 2 in the morning. Every Assyologist who ever lived held a tiny corner of this in their head. The machine held the whole room. It could feel in a way no person ever could. When a phrase on a tablet in London rhymed with a phrase on a tablet in Istanbul. When a broken word here was completed by a broken word a continent away, that is not a faster scholar. That is a different kind of reader entirely. And when they pointed it at tablets written off as too damaged, too abbreviated, too obscure for any reliable human reading, it did not just produce something plausible. The readings came back precise, internally consistent, and in places frankly frightening. Elena was one of the scholars reviewing those early outputs, and she kept reaching for the same strange description. It felt like reading something deeply familiar and completely alien at the same time, like recognizing a face in a photograph taken somewhere you have never been. What the machine pulled out of those tablets falls into 3 categories. Each one lands harder than the last. Before I take you into the first one, I want to ask you something. And I'm asking because what comes next only matters if people actually see it. If a story like this, the real evidence-driven, slightly terrifying kind, is the reason you are here, then subscribe right now because this channel exists to chase exactly these threats to the end. And the algorithm only puts them in front of you if you tell it to. That is the whole ask. Now let me show you the first shock. Actually had necklaces with astronomical references, a moon, a star, various symbols, technology being used 6,000 years ago. The first shock. The tablets behind the first shock are split between the British Museum and the museum at the University of Pennsylvania filed decades ago as medical texts. That part was not news. We already knew Mesopotamian medicine was a serious field, that the Sumerians and the Babylonians who followed them had physicians and a working knowledge of drugs and herbs. What we did not know was how deep it went. According to the project's own analysis, the tablets that scholars had translated by hand represented only about 30% of the medical content actually sitting on them. I want to be careful with that number because it comes from the project rather than an independent count, but the scale it points to is staggering. The other 70% had been set aside over the years as too damaged, too idiomatic, too specialized. The machine read it, and what it found bends our timeline of medicine badly out of shape. These tablets do not just list symptoms. They build causal links between what a physician observes and the hidden condition underneath, in a way that looks like clinical reasoning 2,000 years before we thought clinical reasoning existed. And the medical tablets are not a handful of curiosities either. They run to long organized series, the ancient equivalent of reference manuals arranged by body part and by symptom, with cross-references between them. The 30% we had already read showed us a working medical culture. The 70% we could not read, it turns out, was where that culture kept its actual reasoning. Elena watched the system do something no human had ever done. It stitched together several damaged tablets, scattered across different museum collections that turned out to be broken pieces of the same original document, fragments no one had ever set side by side. Red hole. They describe a diagnostic protocol for what we would now call liver disease. The physician is told to check the color of the patient's eyes, the texture and color of the skin, the nature of the urine, whether the abdomen is swollen, and whether pain sits in one specific region of the body. And then to tie those observations to a likely outcome in a course of treatment. Elena said this was the moment the hair on her arm stood up, not because it was mystical, but because it was so recognizable. This was not magic dressed up as medicine. It was a physician 4,000 years ago doing exactly what a careful doctor does today. Gathering several independent signs, weighing them together, and reasoning toward the thing underneath that you cannot see directly. The herbs and the incantations that sit around it on the tablet are the part we expected. The cold, structured logic running underneath them is the part that should not be there. Now, I am not telling you the Sumerians had hospitals like ours, or that they understood germs, or that their treatments would pass a modern trial. Many of their cures sat right alongside incantation and ritual, which is completely normal for Bronze Age medicine everywhere on Earth. What I am telling you is that the framework, the systematic reading of several connected symptoms to identify one internal condition, is far more sophisticated than anything we previously credited to this period. Hippocratic medicine, the Greek tradition we have always treated as the birthplace of systematic diagnosis, comes roughly 1,500 years later, around 400 BCA. And that is not even the part that unsettles me most. The machine found a group of tablets that earlier scholars had loosely read as treatments for the shaking disease, taken to be a ritual description of epilepsy, which we already knew the Mesopotamians recognized. The full translation tells a different story. The shaking disease texts describe 2 separate conditions with different patterns of onset, different accompanying symptoms, and critically different treatments. One responds to a specific herbal preparation. The other does not, and the text says so directly, then explains why the cure that works for the first will fail against the second. Strip away the ancient vocabulary and look at what that actually is. It is a differential diagnosis. We date that kind of reasoning in Western medicine to the 19th century. The tablet describing it is 4,000 years old. The toll it was taking to mine the gold themselves. They decided to fashion a worker being a slave to mine the gold for them, the second shock. If the medical findings were a quiet earthquake, the astronomical ones are the kind that brings buildings down. We already knew Mesopotamian astronomers were good. The Babylonian tradition is well documented. They tracked the planets, predicted eclipses, and built mathematical models of how the sky moved. The famous Greek gadget, the Antikythera mechanism, gets all the attention. But honestly, Babylonian astronomy deserves far more credit than popular history ever gives it. What the new translation suggests is that early Sumerian knowledge from a period more than 1,000 years before that classical peak was far more advanced than the record ever led on. There is a collection in the Berlin Museum that had been catalogued as administrative records about agricultural scheduling. Boring, low priority. Exactly the kind of thing nobody rushes to translate. But buried inside that administrative content, the machine recognized a pattern of numbers that had nothing to do with planting crops. Decoded in the base 60 system that Sumerian mathematics actually used, the numbers describe the positions of Jupiter, Saturn, and Venus against the fixed background of the stars across a span of observations covering multiple decades. Sit with what that requires to record planetary positions that precisely across decades. You need systematic, organized, multi-generational observation. One person cannot do it. You cannot do it without a consistent method for recording and comparing what you see over many years. You need an institution, a tradition, a school that passes the technique from one generation to the next with enough discipline to keep the measurements accurate. These tablets date to roughly 2900 BCE. That is nearly 3,000 years before the astronomical revolution. We hang on names like Copernicus, Kepler, and Galileo. And more than 1,000 years before the classical Babylonian period, we already respect. Think about what that actually means for a society we tend to picture as barely past the invention of the wheel. Somewhere in early Sumer, there was in effect a research program. People whose job was to watch the same points of light night after night, write down what they saw in a consistent format, compare this year against the record made by someone who had died before they were born, and trust that whoever came after them would carry it on. That is not folklore. That is science with the boring, unglamorous discipline that real science actually requires, running quietly for generations. And the base 60 system they used was not a clumsy workaround either. It is the reason we still cut an hour into 60 minutes and a circle into 360. The fingerprints of these people are on the face of every clock you own. And we did not even know how far their reach extended until a machine read the parts of the page we had skipped. And then the machine found the thing that stopped the room cold. The moment Elena would later describe as the first time the work frightened her. Embedded in those records were calculations, the system flagged as consistent with a sun-entered frame. I need to be clear because this is exactly where stories like this go off the rails. Nobody is claiming a full heliocentric theory. There is no written argument here that the sun sits at the center of everything. What there is a mathematical treatment of planetary motion that comes out simpler, that makes more computational sense if the person doing the calculation is quietly assuming a sun-sea-centered reference frame rather than an Earth-centered one. This is genuinely controversial, and I will not pretend otherwise. Some scholars argue reasonably that the same patterns can be produced inside an Earth-centered framework with complicated enough loops and adjustments, and that objection deserves to be taken seriously. But notice the trap inside it. The Earth-centered mathematics you would need to explain these observations are themselves more complex than anything we had ever attributed to this period. So you are left with two doors, and both of them break the timeline.
Either these people had sun-centered intuitions thousands of years early, or they had Earth-centered mathematics thousands of years ahead of schedule. Either way, something we have been teaching is wrong. Holding a tablet that was written thousands of years ago and being able to read what it says. The third shock. This is the one that is going to stay with you. It stayed with Elena. The Sumerian creation myths are among the most studied texts in the ancient world. The Babylonian creation epic drawn from older Sumerian sources, the story of the gold Enki and the making of humanity, the narratives describing the Anunnaki, the high gods of the pantheon. Scholars have translated and argued over these for more than a century. Or rather, they argued over the parts they could reach, the legible parts, the parts that matched known vocabulary and fit comfortably inside the frameworks we had already built for understanding Sumerian religious writing. The machine translated the rest in their full form. The creation narratives describe the making of human beings in language that is explicitly technical, not metaphorically technical, not poetically technical. The vocabulary the machine identified, when it cross-referenced those words against the technical terms used in Sumerian craft and construction texts from the very same period, describes the manipulation of living material using the same root words and grammatical structures that scribes used when they wrote about deliberately modifying plants for farming. Now, you may already be thinking of a certain author who spent decades insisting. These texts describe genetic engineering carried out by visitors from another world. I am not going there. That is not what the analysis found. And being honest with you means saying so plainly. Those translations were never accepted by mainstream esoterists, and this work does not rescue them. The popular alien narrative is simply not what is on these tablets. What is on them is quieter and in a way far stranger. The Anunnaki are described not as gods in the supernatural sense that later religious tradition assumed, but as a class of beings whose power is explicitly tied to their knowledge and their technique. Are not the only culture that talks about this extraterrestrials had something to do with our development? The word long translated as divine appears in these fuller passages in contexts where the analysis points to something closer to mastery of hidden processes. Beings who knew what others did not, who could do what others could not, whose authority came not from heaven but from holding and controlling specific knowledge. Read that back slowly. If the Anunnaki are knowledge holders rather than deities, then the Sumerian creation myths are not at their core supernatural stories at all. They are social and historical documents. They describe a knowledge hierarchy, a world where some held capabilities that looked like miracles to everyone else. Precisely because the knowledge behind them was guarded and never shared, which forces a question the machine cannot answer, but the full translation makes impossible to avoid. Where did that knowledge come from? If the earliest Sumerian texts describe an already sophisticated class of knowledge holders, who founded civilization, and those texts predate any civilization in the archaeological record that could have produced such knowledge, then we are missing something large, and we missed it for one plain reason. We were only ever reading 30% of what the tablet said. And this is the part that genuinely unsettles Elena more than the medicine, more than the astronomy. Because a knowledge hierarchy is not a story people invent for fun. It is the kind of thing people write down when it is true, when there really is a group that knows how things work and a much larger group that does not. And the gap between them is the single most important fact in their world. We have always read these texts as a culture explaining its gods. The uncomfortable possibility the full translation opens up is that we have been reading a culture explaining its experts and that we mistook the description of a power structure for a description of heaven. In the British Museum, we have objects of all sizes, some pinheads and some gigantic and everything in between, the quiet resistance. I want to be fair here because the easy move in a story like this is to cast the academics as the villains, the gatekeepers protecting comfortable theories from inconvenient truth. That framing is almost always too simple and usually just wrong. Most astrobiologists who have engaged seriously with this work have not rejected it. They have approached it carefully, professionally, and in plenty of cases productively. Several leading scholars have acknowledged that the AI is generating genuinely new readings of difficult texts and that some of those readings are defensible on linguistic grounds in ways that demand serious engagement. That is what a healthy field looks like when it meets new evidence, and it deserves to be said out loud. But there is a smaller, louder reaction that is harder to admire. A defensive crouch that treats these translations not as evidence to weigh, but as a threat to manage. One prominent voice in the field published a response to the project's early findings, making a familiar set of points that AI translation tools, however clever, cannot replicate the contextual judgment a human scholar develops over years of immersion. That the machine can generate plausible-sounding output that does not reflect genuine understanding. That the field should be wary of sensationalizing machine-made readings of texts that were already contested. And none of that is unreasonable. Every one of those points is worth taking seriously. But here is what makes the resistance itself revealing. The same voices most cautious about the new readings are, when you press them, also the most reluctant to say the other quiet part plainly. To stand up in public and admit that there are hundreds of thousands of tablets we cannot read. That we do not have the human capacity to read them in any reasonable lifetime. And that we have therefore been describing an entire civilization from a sliver of its own record. It is a clay tablet. As a matter of fact, it is not a real clay tablet. It is because admitting that would mean admitting the textbooks were built on a fraction. A partial picture we knew was partial, but did not exactly advertise on the confident museum placards. That is an uncomfortable thing to say. And from the inside, that discomfort can look an awful lot like caution. And I understand it. I really do. It is one thing to learn something new. It is another thing entirely to learn that the thing you spent 30 years being certain about was certain only because the inconvenient 90% was sitting in a drawer where you could not reach it. That is not a comfortable feeling for anyone, and pretending otherwise would be unfair to people who have given their whole lives to this. The point is not that they were foolish. The point is that they were human, and humans can only ever conclude things from the evidence they can actually read. Aryans, Babylonians, all those people, they wrote on clay.
That was their natural activity, and clay tablets. What still waits? Pull back, because one thread ties all three shocks together. We built our entire timeline of human genius on the tablets that were easiest to translate. The short, undamaged, formulaic ones. The harder texts, the more technical and broken and linguistically brutal ones, the very tablets most likely to hold advanced knowledge, were exactly the ones left unread. We were grading the intelligence of an entire civilization from its receipts and its homework, while its actual masterwork sat unread in a drawer, and the implications ripple outward in every direction. If Sumerian medicine was more advanced than we believed, then the Greek tradition was not an origin point at all. It was a revival, a partial recovery of something far older. If Sumerian astronomical mathematics was more advanced than we believed, then the Babylonian achievements we already celebrate were themselves built on an even earlier foundation we missed completely. And if the creation texts describe a knowledge hierarchy rather than a supernatural mythology, then the relationship between Mesopotamian religion and the later traditions that grew out of the same part of the world becomes far more complicated and far more interesting than anything in the textbooks. None of this requires aliens or lost continents or secret ancient masters. It requires only the admission that people 4,000 and 5,000 years ago were more capable, more knowledgeable, and more sophisticated than the comfortable version of them we teach. And that we missed it not through any conspiracy, but through the plain limit of translating only what we already had the tools to translate. And here's what should keep you awake tonight. The tablets the machine has read so far are a fraction of what is waiting. Between 500,000 and 1,000,000 cuneiform tablets have been recovered from the ground. Of those, only a 100,000 to 150,000 have been meaningfully translated and published, which means that the rest, hundreds of thousands of them, remain for all practical purposes unread. They sit right now in basements and storage rooms in museums across 4 continents. Some are in stable climate-controlled conditions. Some are not. Some are in collections battered by decades of conflict and instability, whose condition and even location is now uncertain. Some were dug up more than a century ago by archaeologists who cared mostly about monumental architecture and treated the tablets as an afterthought, catalogued in a hurry and never looked at again. Some are fragments so small and so broken that even the machine has very little to work with. But they are containing what we honestly do not know. And once you have watched it happen with Sumer, you cannot unsee the obvious. Next question. If we were this wrong about the very beginning of writing simply because we could not read the hardest evidence. Remember, this has been a map with a central piece missing. Then how many other drawers and how many other museums hold the inconvenient 90% of some other story? We are sure we already understand. The machine did not just translate Sumer, it quietly exposed the method we have been using on all of it. Now go back to Elena, alone in that basement, watching a coherent reading return from a tablet no one had understood in 4,000 years. Words set down by a person who was alive during the early dynastic period of Sumer. A person with a name, a daily routine, worries, opinions, and a specific area of expertise that we are only now beginning to recover. She kept saying she should have been thrilled, and somewhere underneath she was. But sitting there with the cursor blinking, the thing she mostly felt was the weight of the silence that had come before. As a child, I was intrigued by the signs that are used in uniform. But it wasn't until I attended Irving. 4,000 years of a person waiting to be heard while we walked past their drawer. That is why the feeling was grief, not triumph. Grief for all the time lost, for all the questions that could have been asked sooner, all the assumptions that could have been challenged earlier, if only we had had the tools. The machine did not discover that ancient people were smarter than we thought. They always were. It just handed us a way to finally listen to what they had been saying the whole time. And what they are saying is that the story of human civilization is older, deeper, richer, and stranger than the version we have been comfortable telling ourselves. The first chapter was not written in Greece, and it was not written in Rome. It was pressed into wet clay in the valley between 2 rivers by people whose full voice we are only now finally beginning to hear. For 4,000 years, we did not have the ears to listen. Now we do, and I have to be honest with you about my own bias here. Because you deserve that. I find this thrilling. The idea that the ancients are still talking, that the conversation was never actually over, is almost unbearably exciting to me. But Elena's grief is the more honest reaction, and I keep coming back to it. Every year we did not have the tools was a year those voices stayed silent. The triumph is real, and so is the loss. And the only thing that makes the loss bearable is that it is finally ending. So tell me in the comments, where do you think the next shot comes from, and does this excite you or unsettle you? Because I genuinely cannot decide which one I feel. And if you want to be in the room as those hundreds of thousands of unread tablets start giving up what they say, subscribe and stay close because we are going to follow every one of them to the end. My name is Matthew. This is Reef Discovery, and I will see you in the next.